we care about while producing little stress on the environment. Just for as an example of this literature, I was recently involved in a paper came out earlier this year where we look at international trade and the ability of countries to achieve the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Now, discussion about the effects of international trade goes back at least to 1776, and that date is the founding of the US, but also more important to some people, it's the year in which Adam Smith published The Wealth of Nations and talked about the effects of trade on human well-being. What we found in our analysis is that it depends on what country you're in. For the more affluent nations, such as the United States and much of Europe, international trade helps achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. But for many of the rest of the countries in the world, international trade actually slows or retards achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. So what comes from that is to step back and say, okay, different things in different places, and if we can figure out why trade works well in some places and not well in other places, we may be able to design trade policies that advantage everybody. So that's why this kind of analysis is important. This is just that same graph blown up a little bit. We can come back to it if you'd like, but you get a sense that there are a pretty diverse group of countries that are doing pretty well. Okay, let me talk a minute about the pandemic. It certainly affected everything we're up to. And one of the lessons from the pandemic, I think, is that we as a species are capable of rapid positive responses to crises. Throughout the world, while there's certainly many exceptions, most people in most countries initially and even now are doing a pretty good job of social distancing. Sure, we point to the exceptions because those stand out. That's a basic principle of human cognition, that the things that are the exceptions really seem more obvious and evident to us than the things that are typical. But again, most people have done and are doing a pretty good job. Now, the interesting thing about this is that most evidence suggests that most people felt that their personal risk was modest, but that other people were at risk. So these graphs get at that. This is new data we collected over the last month. It's a sample of the US population. This isn't published yet. It's just fresh off my computer. The horizontal axis is, in this case, worry about impact to your own personal health. So the more you are on the right side of this graph, the more worried you are about how COVID-19 will affect your health. This is a question where we ask about how much do you think the pandemic is going to impact the world? So more worried about the world over here on the right. And the horizontal axis in both cases represents how frequently you report wearing masks outside. And the bottom line of these graphs, this is from a multiple regression, so each of these graphs is controlling for the other effects, is concern with your own health had no effect on people's wearing masks, but concern with others really had a strong effect on wearing masks. It greatly increased the propensity that somebody would wear a mask. So what we're arguing in a paper that's in press is that the change in behavior seems to have been driven by personal norms. In social psychology, personal norms are a sense of what I should do as an ethical, responsible person. Later, social norms came into play. Social norms are your observation of the behavior of others. So if you see people wearing masks, you're more likely to wear a mask. If you don't see people wearing masks, you're less likely. So social norms became important, but initially we think it was the personal norms that really drove the behavior. Of course, there's been pushback and politicization, but I think there are lessons here for other issues where public action matters. But a key point here is that we don't want to just say, oh, we did pretty well on the pandemic, so we'll do well on climate change. We need to understand in a fairly detailed way why people were making the decisions they were making and figure out what generalizes and what doesn't and what lessons can be learned. Okay, now the challenges we face, and you'll be familiar with many of these. First, I like to divide the challenges we face into the old ones, the contemporary ones, and the emerging ones. The old problems are ones that really probably started to emerge when we began to do agriculture, aggregated in cities, and began to have substantial power differentials in society. So these are the problems of prejudice, violence, and inequality, and they're still with us, and they're still matters of great concern. Starting in the 1980s, there's one point about this that I want to emphasize, that starting in the 1980s, you began to see in many countries in the world, certainly in the US, a strong influence of conservative or libertarian or neoliberal economic theory in policy circles. So there were a number of arguments that went with this, that we should reduce taxes on the richest and on corporations, that we should use markets for everything, including private prisons, and reduce welfare supports, There were attacks on unions. There's the blocking of government regulation in almost any form, but in particular, blocking of government environmental regulation. And there's a continuation of a long pattern of questioning science, and particularly the science that tends to support regulation. So this really started, in the US at least, in the 1920s and 1930s with questioning the science of lead toxicity when lead was beginning to be used in as tetraethyl lead in gasoline. And it continued with the same pattern of questioning the science around the risk from nuclear fallout, around acid precipitation, around ozone depletion, and now around climate change. So I want to emphasize this because of the political implications of it. So this is a graph of inequality in the United States and in Europe over the 20th and into the 21st century. And you see inequality was fairly high in the early part of the 20th century. And then around World War II and through the 50s and the 70s, it really dropped substantially and stayed fairly low. And then in 1980, you have the elections of Reagan and Thatcher, and these policies that I was just referring to began to be implemented. And those led to substantial increases in inequality. So why does that matter? Aside from the fact that we may think it's unjust to begin with, it matters in terms of politics. Let me point out two reasons I think it matters. Right now, the US government, federal and state, pays about a third of the cost of your college education. When I was an undergraduate in the 60s and 70s, that was much higher. In Austria, Denmark, Germany, Norway, Sweden, the government pays about 90% of the college education. So that means that those students don't have to take on a substantial debt burden, and they don't have to consider paying off that debt burden when they think about what kind of careers they want to pursue and what kind of majors they're going to pursue. So this inequality and this backing away of government support, in this case of higher education, has an implication about what kinds of people we're educating and in what fields. Or consider the support for social change. I put this table down here. I won't go through the details. I'll just give you the stylized explanation. Suppose you've got a citizen who is really concerned about climate change and wants to see her state do more about climate change. And she's trying to mobilize and raise money to start a campaign to get the state to do more. And she may be able to do that. She may be able to persuade friends to donate funds and move forward. Suppose also in the state there's a billionaire and he has the opposite view. He doesn't want the state to take any action on climate change. Well, it's fairly obvious that he can raise a lot more money easily out of his own pocket for this campaign than the ordinary citizen can do, even if she's very effective at mobilizing her friends. So again, this inequality creates a power imbalance, which is problematic. Okay, now I want to talk about the long history of human and natural systems coupled together. We've seen sharp accelerations of the impacts of humans on the environment in sort of two bursts. One was a long period from about 1500 to 1750. So this was a period of colonization, of industrialization, of globalization, the rise of capitalism, and the rise of fossil fuels. And along with those things, if you look at any of a number of metrics, you see very substantial changes in human impact on the environment, very substantial increases in human impact on the environment. And then if you look at the numbers, you see a second acceleration around World War II. Somewhere between 1950 and 1960, things seem to accelerate even more as a lot of these patterns globalized. Now, it's important to remember that the effects of these things are not equally distributed across countries or regions or social groups. There's always a major environmental justice component to any environmental problem, including the global ones. That's something that's been emphasized in the environmental movement at least since the first Earth Day events in the spring of 1970. And these are over here in the upper right, they're just sort of standard global environmental change problems. Species extinction rates 1,000 times what's typical. Climate we haven't seen in 100,000 years. CO2 concentrations we haven't seen in 800,000 years. Acid acidification levels we haven't seen in several million years, and many chemicals to which the biosphere has never been exposed. I want to point to just one tragic example from this earlier transition period of how large an impact human actions can have on the environment. When Europeans arrived in North America, both through direct killings and through disease, it's estimated that as much as 90% of the indigenous population, 55 million people, died over the span of about 100 to 200 years. It's called the Great Dying in the literature. Many of those people were horticulturalists or agriculturalists. And that led to roughly 56 million hectares of land that had been farmed or otherwise managed by those people going back to forests. That led to, according to the models, so much absorption in CO2 that it substantially contributed to the little ice age of the 1500s to the 1800s. So here we have, if you will, colonialism and imperialism actually having an effect on the climate. I'll just quickly run through these sort of stylized examples of how big the problem of climate change is. The national parks, we're going to have Glacier National Park with few glaciers, Joshua Tree without Joshua trees, the Everglades mostly underwater, Arcadia National Park, which is one of the most visited national parks, changed substantially by sea level rise and species shifts. In Michigan, we have Isle Royale and Lake Superior with the longest studied predator-prey population, the wolf-moose system. And because there are no more ice bridges forming, wolves can't migrate to the island, and so we'll have wolves only if the Park Service continues its new policy of periodic reintroductions of wolves to the island. Okay, I also like to point to emerging challenges, and these focus around technologies. So we have nanotechnologies, biotechnologies, information technologies, and cognitive technologies emerging. And I just want to point to the kinds of questions that these things will raise for us as challenges to our decision making. So here's a set of questions. How should self-driving cars and combat robots make life and death decisions? Combat robots already exist, by the way. This is an example of one, the Blowfish combat drone. And who's going to decide how those decisions will be made? What if artificial intelligence and robots eliminate large categories of jobs? Will we, as a society, move towards a 20-hour work week being sufficient for a good life? Or will we go with 50% unemployment and almost no social services? What happens when garage biotech labs for biotechnology, that can create biotechnology on the cheap, which are now being used for all sorts of hacker projects? What happens if somebody decides to use those for bioweapons? How are we going to cope with that? How do we decide about modifying genomes in populations? We certainly are on the verge of having technologies that can modify the genome in an individual human such that that change in genome is heritable. We can also do that in other species, and with gene drives, we can release those species into the wild and have that genetic change move through the population very rapidly. How do we decide about that? In general, who will win, who will lose, and who will decide? So this is another set of challenges we have to face on top of the old challenges that have been with us for thousands of years and the challenges around global change that began to emerge around 1500 to 1750 and accelerated post-World War II. So my point here is that there's no single solution. Let me take climate change as an example. And just as a marking point, consider the Paris Accord goals. The Paris Accord goals argued, or countries agreed to, reducing current greenhouse gas emissions by 35 to 55% by 2030 as a pathway towards net zero emissions and stabilization of climate eventually, but net zero emissions by 2050. So how are we going to get there? So the best estimates we have are that consumer actions can easily and quickly reduce direct greenhouse gas emissions in the developed world by 2.5% or 5% of global emissions, which is 5 to 14% of the Paris goals. So the point here is that consumer action can do something, but it's certainly not going to get us to that 35 to 55%. Corporations, again, easily, cost-effectively, quickly could reduce their emissions, it's been estimated, by 3% of global emissions. And that's 5 to 8% of the Paris goals. So again, a contribution, but it doesn't get us there. Government can do a lot, of course, but there's been very little government action in most countries. If we look at this graph, so this is time and this is greenhouse gas emissions for a variety of countries, we see some downward trend in Europe, but most countries on a flat or upward trajectory. China, of course, as its economy has boomed, has greatly increased its greenhouse gas emissions. I should note that the Chinese are also doing a lot in terms of renewable energy. But the point is that we haven't seen a lot of government action, particularly since that cutting point around 1980, when we saw a real drawback from doing environmental policy. Well, what about calls for social transformation? Really, in order to deal with these problems, we have to do away with capitalism. We have to completely change our consumption patterns. We have to transform society in a revolutionary way. I agree with many of those calls, but the calls for social transformation for what we now call sustainability go back at least to the first Earth Day 50 years ago. If you saw when I was on screen, the poster behind me, it's called The Four Changes. It's an essay by Gary Snyder that was printed as a poster and distributed to organizers for the first Earth Day. And in it, Snyder makes an eloquent call for the kinds of social transformations we're still talking about. My point here is that, yeah, we do need massive social transformation, but we can't wait for the revolution to happen. We have to start addressing these problems now in some ways to pave the way for the larger transformations that we need. So my point is, there is no solution, there are solutions. If we're thoughtful about our decisions, I believe that small changes now can have a positive impact, reducing the stress we're placing on the environment. And they establish a base that allows us to ratchet up and pave the way for big changes in the future. If you add up the contributions from households and the private sector, corporations, that are easy to make and very cost effective, if you add those two together, it's 10 to 20% of the Paris goals. And that doesn't solve the problem, but it is a step in the right direction. The idea of multiple solutions to address climate change isn't really new. The idea of wedges to contribute to reducing greenhouse gas concentrations is well developed. Project Drawdown, which is this report, identifies over 80 different things that we can do to contribute to reducing greenhouse gas emissions and drawing CO2 out of the atmosphere. But what we need now is not just the analysis of what might work, but a more comprehensive analysis of solutions to allow for better decisions. We need to move from an analysis of the technical potential of various options to a full analysis of mitigation potential, what some of us are calling a mitigation science. So what is a mitigation science? A mitigation science would answer several questions. In looking at options for reducing, say, greenhouse gas emissions, it would ask, what are the direct impacts of an action if taken? If I install solar cells in my house, what reduction do I get in the greenhouse gas consumption in the house? If I shift from a gas vehicle to an electric vehicle, what reduction in greenhouse gas emissions occur because of that? It also asks, what are the impacts up and down the supply chain? I should note that that analysis of direct technical potential is all over the literature. Project Drawdown is a fine example of that, but there are many others. And if you look at any of a number of journals, you'll see many, many analyses of the technical potential of changes in behavior and of adoption of technologies. But we also have to ask, what are the impacts up and down the supply chain, which we call the indirect technical potential. So if you think about food consumption in the household, the amount of energy and therefore the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that are associated with you preparing your food and with you refrigerating your food are non-zero, but they're fairly small. On the other hand, if you look across the supply chain, we waste a lot of food in the US, and the greenhouse gas emissions, particularly methane from that food waste, are very substantial. And if you look the other way up the supply chain towards the production of food, we know that there are immense greenhouse gas implications of our food choices. So when you look at the supply chain, you sometimes get a different answer as to what's important than when you only look at the direct action itself. And we need that analysis. And a lot of that is going on. But we also have to ask the social science questions. How likely are people or organizations or governments to take the action? We call this behavioral plasticity. So if you look at the technical potential, both direct and indirect, carpooling could have a really big effect on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. But if you look around at programs that have attempted to get people to carpool more, none of them have been very effective. So when you consider the propensity that people have to actually change, I'm not sure promoting carpooling is a really good strategy unless you can come up with some clever way to get people to change the behavior that no one else has come up with yet. But of course, the behavioral plasticity, the propensity to take actions, depends on the policies, incentives, and programs that are available to facilitate and inform people about these things. And so we could change those policies and incentives and programs. And so then we ask the question about initiative feasibility. How likely are we to be able to adopt and implement effectively policies, programs, incentives that make the actions more likely? Economists have noted for a long time that carbon taxes are a really good way potentially to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The problem is that in the US, at least, carbon taxes seem to have very little initiative feasibility. It's very hard to get people to accept the carbon tax, and so we don't have them in most jurisdictions. Okay, we also have to ask what kinds of indirect effects does taking an action have? These are called in the literature spillover effects. So if I buy an all-electric car, am I more likely or less likely to be attentive to the greenhouse gas implications of my diet? Will I figure I've done my part so I don't have to worry about it? Or will I see, well, I bought the electric car as a first step, but I better be careful about the rest of the things I do? And how likely are there to be spillover effects to the political sphere, which is very important? If I buy an all-electric vehicle, am I more or less likely to care about the stance on climate change of the candidates running for state offices? There's a lot of analysis going on of these spillover effects. And the answer, once again, is it's complicated. There are sometimes negative spillover effects where taking one action seems to crowd out other actions. But there are also positive spillover effects where taking one action sets people on a path to do more. Note that a lot of what is needed for these things is social science research. And I want to point out that we don't invest a lot of money in this kind of social science research. Overall, if you look at climate change research funding around the globe, less than 5% of it is spent on what we would call mitigation social science to answer these questions I've just raised. Okay, now I want to talk a little bit about problems we have in making decisions as a species. Decision-making is sometimes coolly rational, as the rational actor model in economics and other disciplines says it should be, but lots more goes on. Even Mr. Spock has values. We know that a variety of values influence decision-making. In fact, values have a lot of weight in environmental and sustainability decisions. And so we often hear people say, well, we need to change people's values. But we know from the social psychological literature that values are hard to change. What we can do is make people aware of what the implications of their decisions are for their values, which may not be obvious to people. But if you want to affect change, as I've noted, norms can have a huge influence, and we know that they're fairly easy to invoke and fairly easy to change. So I've mentioned personal norms, which is what it is you think you should be doing if you're an ethical person, and social norms, which are what it is that you see other people doing. There are also prescriptive norms, which are what you think other people think you should do. And we know from the literature that it's not that hard to change these things and that it can have a huge impact on our behaviors. So if you want to have an impact, think about how you can influence people's norms. And indeed, as you evaluate your own behaviors, think about what normative influence they have. Are your behaviors visible so other people can imitate them, or are they hidden and so nobody really knows what you're doing? We seem to have two decisions for decision-making, fast and slow. Slow decision-making is that slow, rational, careful, deliberative process, Mr. Spock. Fast decision-making is something that's highly efficient when decisions have to be quick, and it probably worked well for most of human history, but there are problems. We often get numbers and probabilities wrong. There's biased assimilation and motivated reasoning. We use prior beliefs more than evidence to decide on whether or not to accept a new assertion of facts. We hold on to what we already believe, even in the face of new evidence. Values also influence the acceptance of facts. There's a problem called solutions bias. You reject new facts based on how you feel about the solutions that you think will be proposed. So in climate change, I don't want higher gas prices, so I don't think climate change is real. Instead of saying, okay, climate change is real, but I don't want higher gas prices, so let's talk through what we can do to address climate change that doesn't raise my gas prices. So overall, we're very prone to suboptimal decisions because of these biases, and it's easy for us to be manipulated in our decision-making. This is a graph from some work by Shaz Atari and her colleagues. The horizontal axis is the amount of energy actually used or saved by household actions. The vertical axis is what people think those actions use or save. This is a log scale. People think that line drying clothes or adjusting your clothes washer setting to cool has about the same impact as turning off your laptop, when in fact the impact is 100 times greater. So people may want to do the right thing, but they won't necessarily know what the right thing to do is without some help. Okay, then we have problems when we're thinking in groups. We have homophily, which is a tendency to associate and listen to those who think like we do, and to avoid very strongly those who think differently. If you add that to the kind of biased assimilation I've talked about just a moment ago, where we take on information that's consistent with what we already believe, this leads to groups, cliques, if you will, where everyone in the group thinks alike, while groups grow more and more different from each other. Part of the implication of this is if you want to work on sustainability problems, you really need to understand social networks. And I don't mean here social networks as in Facebook or Twitter. I mean the science of social networks. So we can see this phenomena with public opinion on climate change in the US and the Anglophone countries. So this is over time the divergence in opinion between Democrats and Republicans in the percentage of folks in the US public who said that the effects of global warming have already begun, and you see the divergence. This is the League of Conservation score for pro-environmental votes in Congress, scored over time for Democrats and Republicans. And again, you see this divergence. This is overall political ideology of Congress, Senate, and the House. Again, over time, the time changes are going from top to bottom, 73 down to 2011. Again, Senate, House, Democrats, Republicans. The thing I think that is interesting and notable is that Democrats really haven't changed much in their political ideology. In fact, what's happened is the conservatives have become, Republicans have become much more conservative. Okay, so what happens when we bring science into this set of tendencies we have around decision making? First of all, I want to emphasize that decisions are based on facts and values, not either alone. So one of the characteristics of the scientific process, and I sometimes do whole talks on this, is what we think of as the scientific method, and in particular, the way we carry out science as a social process, interacting with other scientists, is an effective way of reducing the difficulties that exist in our decision-making to get at the better assessment of facts. I've mentioned all these problems we have as individuals and collectively making decisions. I would argue that what we think of as the scientific process with peer review and ongoing debate and open evidence and on, as being designed essentially to deal with those cognitive problems and those group decision-making problems. But keep in mind that scientists who are making decision recommendations, who are saying, here's what we should do, are employing values as well as science. They're not making those recommendations based only on their factual knowledge, but also in terms of their values. There's nothing wrong with that. Scientists are citizens too and have a right to make those recommendations. But we should keep in mind that the decision recommendation does depend on values as well as facts. So there's a belief amongst many scientists that if we could all come to common understanding of the facts, along with their uncertainty, we would make different decisions. But in fact, the research shows that that may not actually change decision-making. Many scientists assume that to get the consensus on a decision, we have to convince people about the facts. And this is called the information deficit model. And one of the things we know from social, psychological, and communication research is that the information deficit model is wrong. That trying to get people to agree about the facts is hard to do, and even if you do it, it doesn't necessarily lead to agreement about what actions we should take. The information deficit model assumes that everyone has the same values, that there's value consensus, but that's seldom true. Finally, I want to make the point about science that as we move from general scientific understanding to specific contexts where decisions have to be made, there's almost always an increase in uncertainty. So think about the terrible tragedy of lead contamination in Flint, Michigan, where lead got into the water supply and basically poisoned many, many children. We know a huge amount about the toxicity and the metabolism of lead in the abstract. But to use that science in the context of the Flint community to deal with that tragedy, you've got to engage with the community to find out how people are using water, what people's diets look like, and a whole lot of contextual information that doesn't come from the abstract science, but comes from the locally grounded knowledge of indigenous and local people. So we're always, in applying science to real context, needing to engage with this indigenous and local knowledge. So how do we do better around these challenges? The National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, often recommends linking scientific analysis to public deliberation in trying to deal with these difficult problems. And in fact, they've issued a number of reports on sustainability issues, including climate change, the management of wild horses and burros, and a variety of other issues, management of biodiversity, as well as those emerging technologies I've talked about, where they argue that we need to have an ongoing process where scientific analysis and scientists are in dialogue with interested and affected parties to figure out how to go forward. The idea is that this process, which is sometimes called linked analysis and deliberation, or sometimes referred to by the shorthand term analytic deliberation, is an iterative process that's co-designed by all involved. So you have a discussion about how you're going to do the process. It helps to get the science right. As I just mentioned, for many problems around sustainability, you've got to have community expertise in the room to understand what's going on in the local context. It also helps to get the right science. It makes sure that the scientific analysis is addressing issues on the community agenda as well as those on the scientific agenda. And it helps build trust in the science by interaction over time. So there's a hope. These things we know work pretty well from a lot of evidence, including a major National Academy study on public participation in environmental assessment and decision making. We also hope, although we have less evidence of this, that this kind of fair and competent deliberative processes around the science can effectively meld facts and values to guide decisions, and can allow beliefs and values to evolve, and over time build trust and confidence in all the communities, both the scientific community and the community of interested and affected parties, so that there's sort of a short-term benefit around particular issues of getting the science right, getting the right science, and building trust in that science, and a longer-term effect of essentially building capacity to deal with these difficult issues. And when you look at those issues I alluded to that are coming down the pike, that are on the horizon around the emerging technologies, we very much need to have these kinds of processes in place. And in fact, that's what the National Academies has recommended frequently. Okay, let me close by thinking about what you can do. I'm often asked this in questions and answers, and so I want to anticipate a little bit. What can you do as a consumer? Well, I'm not going to point to specific things you could do. What I'm going to point to is ways to think about what you do as a consumer. So you can ask what kind of changes you can make in your consumer behavior that will have the greatest impact. And to walk through that, you want to think about what is the direct impact of your action. If you make a particular food choice when you're purchasing, how much energy is involved and how much greenhouse gas emissions are involved in that choice. But you can also ask how persistent the impact is. People tend to focus on short-term immediate behavior, like the purchase of consumer goods that are immediately consumed, versus on the purchase of things that have long-term impacts like appliances and cars. So you need to think about how persistent the impact will be. And then, as I've mentioned, it's really important to think about the indirect impacts up and down the supply chain. So again, food, very little direct impact, but huge impacts up and down the supply chain. And then the issue of norms. What signal are you sending to people who respect you and observe you? Are there actions you can take that really send a strong signal and get other people on board with these actions? And finally, what signal are you sending up and down the supply chain to the folks who are involved in commercial activities around these activities? I just saw an announcement that Amazon is going to move towards more carbon labeling. And this is a result of people campaigning to get them to do that. And we'll have to see how much impact it has, but I think it's at least a worthy thing to try, and we'll need research to figure out how much impact it actually has. But we clearly have examples of these things. The food industry, for example, is particularly sensitive to what they perceive to be consumer preferences. So you may have noticed that McDonald's no longer serves any eggs that aren't cage-free. That came about because they were perceiving a lot of people care about the welfare of laying hens and were appalled about the conditions that were typical in the US egg industry. And so they kind of got the message and they sent to their suppliers, starting at this date, we're no longer going to buy any eggs that come from traditional caged hens. And that changed the whole industry. And that was entirely because McDonald's perceived the consumers cared about this issue. And so a message was sent up the supply chain, if you will. What can you do as a citizen? Where can you have the greatest impact per unit effort? Obviously, voting, but also getting into the process of voting by not just voting, but by registering people, by being a poll worker, by being a poll watcher. And I looked this up. The voter registration deadline in Colorado for online registration is Monday, 26th October. And in Colorado, you're fortunate to be one of the states when you can actually register on election day, but I wouldn't depend on that. That's kind of a high-risk strategy. Go out and get registered if you're not. But think about participating in a more active way by registering people, again, being a poll worker or a poll watcher. I think it's also really important to participate in campaigns for candidates and issues and for parties at the local level. An awful lot of people get mobilized around presidential campaigns, and that's good. But to build the base for those presidential campaigns, you need to have action at the local and the state level. And so if you're inclined to get involved in political campaigns, think very hard about what you can do locally, not just in terms of national politics. There are other things that are very popular to do, and they're good things to do, but I would ask you to think through how much impact they actually have. There's the issue of trying to be persuasive on Twitter or Facebook or other social media, Instagram. You're talking to friends. And people are not easily persuaded when in arguing mode. So there's nothing wrong with doing those things, but I'm wondering whether or not they have much impact. And of course, there's research literature on it that shows that social media doesn't readily change people's opinion once people get those opinions entrenched, the kinds of processes I was talking about before. Demonstrations. I was at Kent State in the 1960s and early 1970s. I've certainly participated in many demonstrations. They're nice, they're empowering to those who take part, but I think they have a high ratio of effort to impact. And I also note that violence is often very counterproductive. And one of the histories of demonstrations we have in the US is it's very easy for provocateurs who are trying to sabotage a social movement to engage in violent actions as part of a demonstration and delegitimate the demonstration overall. Making changes on campus. This is a very good thing to do. But think about, is a campaign to make a change here at CSU higher leverage than a campaign to make changes off campus? I'm not saying don't do the on-campus campaigns, but certainly think through the issues. I'm going to skip over the criteria for decision-making just in the interest of time, so we have plenty of time for questions and answers. But one of the things I'm arguing with this slide and in some writing that I'm doing is that we need to think through what constitutes a good decision. What characteristics do we want to have in our decisions, and then figure out ways of doing decision-making that leads us in that direction. So to summarize, there's no simple highway to move us through the challenges we face, but many roads. The decision-making is challenging, but we can think through multiple implications of our actions to make tentative decisions. We can learn as we go, and then we can do better. And we must always attend to diversity. Different communities face different situations and have different histories and need to be dealt with attention to that diversity. Something I've not emphasized enough, but represents some of the biggest challenges and most interesting work, is around our relationship to other species. There's a growing field of animal studies that is providing that scholarship. And if you're interested, MSU has a great website called animalstudies.msu.edu that introduces you to that. And with that, I will stop.
Thank you so much, Tom. You've put a lot of questions out there, and there's some questions coming in. But I would just like to say that you have, on the one where you discussed, this is kind of a question, linked the, doing a linked analysis and deliberation, and examples of what we can do. Are they any faster than, say, waiting for Earth Day and the revolution, as you said earlier? If we want to make change and we want to see it happen quickly, you've given us a lot of examples, frameworks to work with, but which ones would you say work better?
Well, with regard to linked analysis and deliberation, I chaired a big study called, I mentioned, called Public Participation in Environmental Assessment and Decision Making. And one of the things, when we called for federal agencies who are making environmental assessments and making environmental decisions to use these kind of deliberative processes, their argument was, oh, that's so slow, it takes so long, it's so expensive to do. And some of the experts on our panel pointed out to them that if you actually look at the literature, that kind of process where you build trust in a community is a lot faster than waiting for the lawsuits to resolve themselves. So that there is actually an efficiency in these kinds of processes if they're done well. And what I didn't get into is we have a lot of knowledge and even design principles for how you do those processes well. You don't have to reinvent it. There's a lot of work on those kinds of processes. I view, by the way, the poster, if you can see it, that's behind me, is the 4 Changes poster by Gary Snyder that I alluded to. It's a really nice essay that Snyder, who was kind of the poet laureate of the environmental movement, prepared, thinking about what we needed to do. And my view is that if we want to really bring about these changes, we probably are best off doing it incrementally. It doesn't do a lot of good to, I think, to sit around and think about what the ideal world would be, the best, in the sense of it being the enemy of the good, but rather to experiment and try things and see what works, and to promote the things that work well and use that to build towards the larger transformation. That's the way I think we've historically made progress, and I think it's the way we'll make progress in the future. Certainly there have been times in history where we have sort of revolutionary transformations, but those are few and far between, and an awful lot of them don't come out the way we want them to anyway. As to what it is you should do, you as a community, I think you really have to analyze your own context. And so what I've done, which is easy, is to provide some of the questions that have to be answered. But those questions don't have general answers, they have context-specific answers. So what we might do at Michigan State may be very different than what you should do at CSU, because you have to think through the implications of all those questions for your local context.
Yeah, and I want to break in here and mention
Yeah.
Everybody should be sure and go to the question and answer, the little Q&A. And I think there's a question from Tom Lovejoy, and then Jonathan Maxwell says you've already answered his question. So.
Okay, I see Tom's question, and no, it's my understanding that it wasn't just a throwaway line. That Shaz Atari, who is a social psychologist at Indiana University, did this really neat study where she asked people about how much energy do you think these activities use. And she found that people thought that basically turning off their laptop had about the same energy impact as the difference between drying your clothes outside on a line versus using the electric or gas powered, well, I guess it'd be electric powered dryer. Whereas in fact, the difference is, according to the numbers I've seen, about a factor of 100 different in favor of line drying. And so Shaz's point is, because of these cognitive biases, people will get it wrong when they decide to do something for sustainability or to protect the environment. And so we need to have some education to help people pick the right actions. Just as an aside, she did the same kind of study, also published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, on people's perceptions of water use. And people have that about right. And that's because everybody knows what a gallon or a liter of water is, but nobody knows what a kilowatt hour is. So we're differentially calibrated. Some things we're pretty well calibrated, some things pretty not calibrated. So this question from, I answered your question. Yeah. By the way, for veterinarians, I would note, aside from the sort of sustainability aspect, that you might have a lot of fun looking at that animalstudies.msu.edu website. The Animal Studies program is heavily involved with the vet school here at Michigan State, and trying to think through the sort of complicated ethical implications. And actually, just as a pitch, one of our graduates from Animal Studies just took on the job as the first curator for humane education at any zoo in the United States. He has that job now at the Detroit Zoo. It also came out of the Environmental Science and Policy program in Sociology, and has a dual PhD in education as well. But the Detroit Zoo in particular is really trying to think through some of the ethical issues around care of animals in a zoo setting. So they've got a lot of neat materials on that.
Okay, Jessica Witt has a question for you.
I took out a slide in the interest of time about what MSU had done that had a big impact. Everything's sort of up in the air right now with the COVID and the new situation. But if you let me put that aside for a second, MSU has a coal-fired power plant. A few years ago, the president said, we can't do this. We've got to get rid of this coal-fired power plant. But how do we do it? And so I was on a committee that we looked at options. One option was biomass, but we were already burning as much biomass as we could probably get our hands on. Geothermal is not an option in central Michigan. Wind power looks great if you're on the coast of Michigan because of Lake Michigan and Lake Huron have really good wind resources, but that's a long transmission line to our campus. So what we did was invest in solar, and we put in over every parking lot on campus above, I think it's 20 cars, solar carports. So all of our parking spaces are now covered with solar panels. The reason that was a tricky decision is because Michigan, central Michigan is the cloudiest place in the United States by some metrics, cloudier than Seattle. So the return on those solar panels is a lot less than they would be if you did it at CSU, for example. So it took some real thinking through the issue and some real leadership saying, we're not going to get the return on investment that a lot of people would with solar panels, but we need to do this. It's the right thing to do, and it'll pay off in the long run. So that was one of the things I think where we've had big impact. I think we have a lot more to do in thinking through both our farm operations, because like you, we have a huge amount of farm operations, and also dorm life, how we can do a better job in terms of the impact of the dorms up and down the supply chain.
Daniel Scott.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the way, first of all, I'm not an expert on how to have these conversations, and there is literature on this. But what I understand from that literature is it can be important to try to drop back and figure out what you agree on and what you disagree on. It's tricky because, as I mentioned, people's beliefs about the world are actually substantially driven by their values. So it can be hard to just use evidence to convince people. But the issue of finding common ground can be very important. For example, a lot of folks who are conservative, who don't think climate change is real and are not interested in energy efficiency programs on the grounds of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, are in fact quite supportive of energy efficiency and alternative energy programs if they come in the form of energy self-reliance for the US. Now, energy self-reliance can also mean more drilling and more fracking and so on. But one can find a common ground around energy efficiency or about a lot of renewals, that we ought to do these things even though we have different motivations as to why. So that would be my quick answer. It is very difficult. And what I think we learned from the literature is just having a flat out debate really isn't all that helpful. The other thing that does matter is establishing a personal relationship. There's a lot of research that shows that getting past the sort of the debate about the issue and getting back to finding common grounds as human beings then builds a base for going forward and trying to be respectful, which is very difficult in these times, being respectful about what the base of that person's views are. I'm in Vermont right now. I spend a lot of time in Vermont. People think of Vermont as the state of Bernie, which it certainly is. But Vermont's had a Republican governor half of the 30 years that I've had a house here. There are candidates here who run as Democrats and Republicans for the state Senate to get the endorsement for both parties. So it is possible to have these kinds of dialogues. You just have to find a common starting point. Running out of time. Oh, I'll take whatever questions we have time for.
Start with maybe Allie Borman.
How much funding really goes towards a deeper understanding of social dynamics of pushing sustainability initiatives forwards compared to direct climate research? Well, there's a paper, I've forgotten the authors, but I can send it along. Benjamin Sovacool was one of the authors. Their estimate is on the kinds of things focused on mitigation of climate change as opposed to adaptation of climate change. About 5% of climate change research is on mitigation social science, and then 95% is on the physical sciences, a little bit of that on ecology and ecological sciences. So basically, not much. Yeah, and I'll be happy to stay on for a little bit.
Okay, well, let's go to Paul Hellman's then. Let me
Okay,
see.
Paul. That it's all too late. I mean, I run into that a lot. I certainly have many friends who think it's all too late. There have been points in my life when I've thought, oh, there's no turning back from this, and I've always been wrong. That we do make improvements in a lot of ways. And I left out those slides too. A lot of things have gotten a lot better over time. So are we entraining more climate change than we really should? For sure. But to walk away and say it's too late means that you're not contributing to making it better. I view these things as risk management. I first got interested in environmental issues after I was interested in human ecology as a science because of Paul Ehrlich's essay, Eco-Catastrophe, where, as Paul often does, he said the world's going to be destroyed because of the amount of Agent Orange that we're using in Vietnam. And ever since then, while I was motivated by that, I also thought these catastrophic arguments are very problematic. So what I say to those folks are, I think this is not a matter of yes or no, we're going to solve the problem or we're not going to solve the problem. It's a matter of reducing risk. It's a matter of how much better or worse the world's going to be. And so if you walk away saying it's too late, you're saying there's nothing you can do that reduces risk or reduces damage to the environment or improves human welfare. And I just think that's not true. That there are things we can do that do change things for the better.
Let me just kind of pause here and say we know the time is up. We've got a few more questions, so we're going to stay online for those. But thanks to everybody who's come. We appreciate it, and we thank Tom. And now we're going to go on with some other questions. Kathy Galvin has one about the prospect of increased funding for mitigation social science, saying that ILK is so not important yet, not well incorporated into global change science or UN.
Yeah, again, another slide I took off was saying, well, okay, we had the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which were really pushed by Colombia, a developing country, to move from the Millennium Development Goals to the Sustainable Development Goals was an initiative led by Colombia. And one of the criticisms of the SDGs is that they don't pay enough attention to environmental justice issues, of which one dimension is the indigenous people. But my view is, okay, so we get the SDGs out there and now we criticize them and we think about how they could be better, and that leads to more thinking and eventually revision of them. And there's actually a major report done on indigenous perspectives on the Sustainable Development Goals that I think will have influence on the next round of Sustainable Development Goals. So I also have a colleague, Kyle White, who has done wonderful work. He's a philosopher. He's also a Chippewa. And he's really written a lot of papers, not only giving the indigenous perspective on climate change, for example, but also talking to scientists about how you can effectively work with these communities, about what you shouldn't do, but also what you should do if you want to really establish a long-term relationship of incorporating indigenous and local knowledge into these things. So I think slowly the message is getting there. Again, I can point to a dozen reports from the US National Academy of Sciences on a wide variety of topics: biodiversity, climate change, managing wild horses and burros, gene drives, altering the human genome, and on, all of which call for these kinds of processes for societal decision making. So I think the message is getting there. As for funding, I think we just have to keep pushing that this stuff is crucially important. I've been arguing for more funding for environmental social sciences for, as Diana knows, a long time. And we're making some progress. Incremental changes.
It's about incremental changes and a balance with the reality of exponential changes such as growth.
Yeah, well, the incremental changes could potentially be exponential as well as they spread through social networks. I mean, this is one of the things we realize, that if you begin to have normative influences and that spread is through a network, that's actually a growth pattern that looks exponential. So it is a race that there, but one of the issues about economic inequality that I'd like to point to is some forms of inequality have actually reduced over the last 30 or 40 years, some metrics and some ways of looking at it. But the reason I emphasize those policy issues is that the increase in inequality within nations and to some degree across nations was driven by a very specific set of policies, and we can change those policies. And so I don't think this is an inevitable dynamic of the system. I think it's a result of particular choices that were made, and it could be reversed. And of course, we always have technological disruption, so it's hard to know what will come in the future. I guess what I'm calling for is that folks interested in sustainability should be paying attention to those NIBIC emerging technologies and trying to think through how they can help us and how they might present problems for the older problems of inequality, violence, and global environmental change.
Okay, let's see. One message in your talk is that it's not just facts, but also values that impact decisions. This implies it's values that are driving us apart. But I think overall, many values are shared. And the question is, this makes me wonder if there's something else that's causing the division over climate change. If so, what do you think it is, and how do we address the underlying issues?
Yeah, there's a lot of empirical research on values around the world. There's a lot of commonality to values. As I implied with the COVID example, a lot of people will often be willing to act quite altruistically, that they're taking action not because they think it protects them, but because they think it protects other people. But I think part of the division that we see around climate change is a sort of wedge strategy that really emphasized these differences in values by pointing out implications of climate change for people's values. And so we could go the other way and try to point out where we have common values and how they might help heal the division over climate change. I should also note, we shouldn't get too pessimistic, that while you see that huge divergence between Democrats and Republicans, the overwhelming majority of Americans believe that climate change is real, that it's happening now, that we should take action on it. That's less true when you move to, say, members of Congress. So we shouldn't while it's important to understand the dynamics of homophily and the formation of cliques and groups drifting apart, we should also remember that as with COVID and so too with climate change, the majority of people are on board with this is a serious problem and we need to do something about it. I also think that, as I mentioned, repeat myself, that if you really want to affect change, you should really think about norms. So what do people feel is an ethical thing to be doing? What do they observe other people doing? And what do they think other people think they should be doing? Again, huge literature in social psychology about this. And we know that it's a strong influence on behavior, but unlike values, it's a fairly easy thing to change by providing people with new information.
Okay, and the next one is to please share your slides.
Oh yeah, I will. I've already sent a PDF of them, but let me send it again because I caught a couple typos from the first version. And so.
And then Stacey Baumgarten has a question, I think, about elections, small mitigation actions and local elections.
Yeah, in the literature, we often say, well, there's consumer actions and there's citizen actions. And we say that to emphasize the importance of citizen actions because people say, oh, we can't solve this as consumers. And most of us say, nobody's ever said we're going to solve this as consumers. We're saying we can contribute to the solution as consumers. But your action as a consumer also has political implications. So you need to think about what kind of signals are you sending up and down the supply chain, because corporations do respond to some degree to consumers. Something else I cut out, I think, was a slide that says corporations are variable. Some corporations are doing everything they can to try to solve the problem of climate change, even if it cuts into their profits. Other corporations are greenwashing. Some corporations are spending a lot of money to obfuscate and to block any action on climate change. It's not one size fits all with corporations any more than it is with the public. Okay, so I think in terms of leverage, that your biggest impacts are around political action. So if you have to make a decision between spending time and energy on working on politics and spending time and energy working on things related to consumer actions, I'd go with the politics every time. And while I've worked a lot, excuse me for declining the phone call, sorry. A bunch of us have developed what's called values, beliefs, norms theory. See where that comes from in terms of the work I've been talking about. While people associate that with consumer behavior because it's been used a lot, the theory was actually developed to try to understand why people support social movements. So I think the political actions are really important. And again, you have to think through your personal circumstances and your context as to what you want to do. I don't think there's one size fits all. Some people, just thinking in this campaign, I know people who love making phone calls for the political campaign. I know people who would never make a phone call who are very happy texting. I know people who aren't texting, they're writing postcards. All good. It's what you feel like, what you feel you can do effectively.
Okay, we've got quite a few more questions. We're going to try to get to all the way down to this one that's anonymous that says, thank you very much. But this one's one from Pascal and in physics.
Yeah.
Tackling climate change with something like the Green New Deal. People, it's very, very popular. The Green New Deal is popular with people. But the power in the government has dragged their feet for decades, continue to do so. It appears that the citizenry already knows more or less what's going on and is demanding change, but the ruling class is unresponsive. What do power throughout much of the world are they in fact quite undemocratic?
Yeah, I agree largely, but I would point out that a lot of the turn towards anti-environmental and inegalitarian policies that really increase inequality, really came about because of concerted actions by conservatives. I don't want to label all conservatives with this, but by a certain faction of the conservative movement, mostly leading up to and really beginning to take effect around 1980. So a lot of that huge rise in inequality you see in the United States was a result of changes in the tax code. And we could change the tax code back again to what it was, say, when Reagan was elected president. And you would see reduction, not right away, but slowly you would see reductions in inequality. So I don't think these things are locked into the dynamics of the system. I think that they're a result of choices we make. And certainly there are a lot of constraints on the choices we make. So we have certainly seen in the US and in many other countries increased moves to kind of rig the system to make it less democratic and less equal. And I think what we have to do is to resist those moves as much as we can. And so, that's one of the reasons I emphasize the election and political activity. So I'm guardedly optimistic. I think we've seen huge amounts of progress very quickly. Let me give one example of cultural change. If you think about the change that's occurred in the United States in the acceptance of gay marriage, where when I was an undergraduate, the university would not allow the Gay and Lesbian Caucus, as it was called then, to be a campus organization. We found a way around that. I happened to run the Free University at the time, and we created a class in the Free University that was actually the caucus in which the GL, back then just G&L people organized. And now if you look at, while there's certainly pushback from some circles, the widespread acceptance of gay and lesbian marriage is just amazing. And it occurred very rapidly as a normative change in the society. So we can see those kinds of changes. Keep in mind that we have this cognitive process, one of the biases I talked about, that we really think that things that are highly visible are more frequent or more probable than they really are. So we are properly very attuned to all the examples of racism that we see. But in fact, the country has probably on a whole become less racist over generations. Now, that's not to say that there isn't terrible racism going on and we don't need to address it, but that social change does occur. And so I'm somewhat optimistic that we can have these kinds of normative changes ongoing, that can lead to policy change. So I hope that's somewhat responsive.
Okay, let's do the last two here.
Okay.
How do we deal with the issue of ecological unequal change in adopting many of these technological solutions and transition to renewable?
Yeah, I alluded very quickly to this paper that showed that international trade is good for the have countries and not good for the have not countries. And that's, that isn't a new finding with us. Well, it is new finding in terms of the methodology we used in that particular paper. But this gets back to the idea of ecologically unequal exchange, that the world trade system is set up to advantage some countries and disadvantage other countries. And I think what we have to do is to do the analyses to figure out exactly what's going on and why. And we know a lot about that. And then push for policies that overcome those problems. So we try to make sure that the emerging sustainable technologies and renewable technologies don't have these kinds of adverse effects, because we understand how that plays out. So again, it's both a political struggle and a scientific issue. We need to understand the processes, and then we need to use that to implement policies that redress the inequalities.
Okay, how important is it to make sustainable options and knowledge prevalent in somebody's day-to-day life in order to open people up to improving their impact consistently?
Yeah, I think that's very important. And you don't want to do it by drumming on people or beating them up. That people who are well-intentioned don't know necessarily what to do or don't really understand the implications of their actions. So I go back to Shazatari's graph, where people misestimate the difference between turning off your laptop and hanging out your laundry to dry rather than putting it in the dryer. There's a factor of 100 difference there in energy consumption. Most people think they're about the same. So we need to kind of give people the information they need. The same thing with supply chain effects. What's the impact of your food consumption? Well, it turns out it's massive, but it's not massive because it takes a lot of energy to cook your food and refrigerate it. It's because of the supply chain, and the supply chain isn't always visible to you. So we need to kind of be providing people with information in ways that are accessible to them to help them improve their impact consistently. And I also think we need, and that's the point of this idea of mitigation science, of asking all these questions, to try to figure out what behaviors you really want to target. It might be helpful to give people a list of 100 things they can do and let them choose from it. But it might be more helpful to figure out what are the things that people can readily do that are easy to carry off that have the biggest impacts. And that might also have spillover effects, that when people do that one action, they may be much more likely to do other actions. And so we need, and that's kind of scientific analysis. What's easy to do, what's hard to do, what kinds of things are easy to encourage or hard to encourage, what kinds of things have big positive spillover effects and what don't. So I think it's very important to do it, but I think we need to think through the most effective ways to do it.
Okay, that is it. And I want to thank you again for visiting SOJES today. It's been great.
My pleasure. I hope that was useful. It was certainly fun for me, as always, and look forward to seeing you again in a couple of weeks.
Okay. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye.